All right, well, thank you for having me here today. I'm going to talk about snowboarding in southern Vermont. And throughout the writing process, my definition of southern Vermont was much wider in the beginning. It went up all the way up here to Akimo, Killington, all the way down to Mount Snow. But I wrote the book because I grew up in Manchester and Stratton, and I grew up pretty much the same time that snowboarding was developing. And I was working at the Stratton Mountain School, and I was having lunch with some of the coaches there, Ross Powers to be exact, and we were sitting there talking, and I sort of realized at that point that I've sort of witnessed the evolution of the sport in Manchester, and over the years I've gotten to know a lot of the people who have been part of the development of the sport, so I felt like it was a good idea to document it. The challenge was I didn't have a bookend. I had a good start. They didn't have an end to the story. So when the U.S. Open left Stratton in 2012 and went out to Vail, Colorado, it kind of hit me like that I finally had a good end to the story. What the book is not about, and what I'm not going to discuss today, is the history of the sport itself. I didn't even really want to try that at all. There is stories, or the picture on the left of 14th century Turkey of people riding down on a board with a rope. The item in the middle is a 1939 patent for a similar sort of board device. The biggest item that influenced so many of the people who eventually built snowboards is the Snurfer, which was built in 1968. And a big yellow sort of banana-looking device with a rope, and so many people sort of got their first exposure to what would become snowboarding in the 60s, including Jake Burton, Jake Burton Carpenter, who started Burton Snowboards. He was vacationing at Bromley, and he got one for Christmas, and that really sparked a lifelong passion for the sport. It's also not the story of all the different snowboard companies. There's a lot of debate over who invented snowboarding, really. You have Jake Burton Carpenter and Tom Sims. They were the sort of the East Coast, West Coast conflict of the early 80s. And then there's barefoot snowboards and winter stick snowboards and Kemper snowboards and GNU snowboards. So they were all coming up at the same time, and I just didn't really want to touch who invented it. And so I really, once again, wanted to stay on the local story. I call myself a local historian, so that was the focus of the book. So Jake Burton Carpenter, he was a student out in Colorado, a downhill skier, broke his collarbone on the way to a concert, and that sort of steered him away from skiing, and he decided to head down the path of developing snowboards. He had a large inheritance from the death of his mother, so that was sort of his seed money to start the company. He opened up a factory in Londonderry, Vermont, right across from the deer weighing station, and according to Carpenter, all the guys weighing their deers during hunting season didn't really know what was going on across the street. Didn't know what this Burton board guy was. But he spent a lot of time developing prototypes and learning the different types of techniques to shaping a board and different layers of wood. And there was a lot of trial and error. A lot of the tales involved boards flying out of the machines and embedding into walls, and a lot of near accidents. But he did develop, this is something called the solo ski in 1978, and then eventually developed a board that's basically had a rope, and it had almost like water ski bindings on the back. And he also held a competition. He worked at that time with two relatives. That was the extent of the factory, and he had a contest for the logo, and Mimi Wright of Londonderry designed that logo, and that was a logo that's still used today. And it's become kind of the iconic image for the company. First snowboard ad on the right, didn't even call it a snowboard. It's called a Burton board. In fact, when I was growing up in Vermont in the early 80s, I called it Burton boarding, and everyone called it Burton boarding. That was our only exposure to the sport. So we saw it was a Burton board, so we thought that was the name of the sport, and actually it wasn't. It was just the name of his product, kind of like Xerox. You know, it's the company name has become associated with what the company does. But things didn't work out great in the beginning. He built these boards. He worked really hard to market them and brought them to shops, put out ads in magazines like skateboard magazines, but he ran out of money. So he retreated back to Long Island where he was from, and he sort of regrouped. And what he knew and what he realized is that he had this great product, but he didn't have an audience. So when he re-entered the business, he decided, I need to go out and promote the business. I need to create a critical mass of people who are going to enjoy this product, because up to that point it was just like a sled or something. Nobody really knew what it was. So when he re-entered the process, he really focused on promoting the product, going to ski areas, doing demonstrations. And this is long before lifts, so most of the snowboarding, or being allowed on mountains, so most of the snowboarding was a back hill experience. He actually named one of his early boards the back hill. And it was, he used local hills in Londonderry, sort of dirt piles out by the maintenance shacks. When Route 7 was being built through Manchester, they would often go out to the construction of the road where they had these big cutouts in the side of the road where all the dirt was taken from. And that was the extent of it. And at this time, Stratton was known as sort of had a Tyrolean feel to it. There was a lot of Austrians that had migrated to Stratton. Most of the architecture is Tyrolean feeling. There was a lot of Tyrolean, Austrian-themed restaurants. All the ski instructors at Stratton had Austrian background. And Jake went to work for Emo Heinrich, who was the head of the Stratton Mountain Ski School, and he also owned an inn called the Birken House. And he bartended there during the night, and then also used his workshop down in the basement to work on boards. Perhaps what Stratton was known for most at that time was the Stratton Mountain Boys. You could go up to the base lodge and do things like the chicken dance, and all the instructors also played instruments, and you had a night of Tyrolean dancing. And so I find it interesting that Jake and Emo were there at the same time, and Jake is going to represent sort of the new identity for Stratton. You know, Emo Heinrich had the old one, but with snowboarding entering, it's going to move away from the Tyrolean vibe and move more towards what it is today, snowboarding. Most of the early snowboarding was, any snowboarding that was done on a groomed trail was done illegally, for lack of another word. A lot of times they would wait till nightfall, and the kids who worked in the factory, and when I say factory, it was a barn, they would all pile in a car, and one guy would bring him up to the top of Bromley, as far as he could go where the condos were, drop him off. They'd go down the hill, and then he would race down in the car, pick him up, and then a new driver, and they would do that all night. Jake's wife, Donna Carpenter, actually would bribe the groomers with brownies, saying, give us a ride up so we can ride down. And a lot of the early snowboarders who did this at night would also time it with the groomers. They would wait till the groomers went up to the top of the mountain and then turned around and came down the mountain. With the lights of the groomers, they could snowboard in front of the groomers and have light until they got going so fast that they outran the groomers. One of the first events that really put snowboarding on the map in Vermont is the 1982 National Snow Surfing Championship, which was held in Woodstock at Suicide 6. And this was put on by a name of Paul Graves. He owned a ski shop. And this was basically a downhill race. Get on and hold on for dear life. And there were some turns, but in general, it was really who could stay on without falling. In its early stages, the starting gate is actually a dining room table turned upside down and covered with snow. They didn't even have a starting gate. And holding on to ropes, a lot of people in sneakers or just boots. And Jake Burton Carpenter had his team, and this is the team that went up there in 1982. A lot different than the teams that you see today, that's for sure. Just sort of a bunch of guys who liked the sport. They weren't in real uniforms or anything. The first, excuse me, the first champion was a guy named Paul Bouton, and this is him here. He won this event in 1982, and he was one of the best snowboarders at that time. He also kind of disappeared from the scene by the mid-'80s, so he became kind of a mystery, and nobody really knew what happened to him. To such a degree, in the 90s, a snowboard magazine put this out. Doug Bouton, excuse me. But he kind of went missing, and I actually posted something today on Facebook about this, and somebody replied and said he died in September. So the wonders of Facebook, I guess, but it finally did answer the question of where he went. I spent a lot of time trying to hunt him down when I was writing the book, and in retrospect, I could have just posted something and found something. So eventually, what is known as the Snow Surfing Championship, the US Open, these annual events where people were competing, it will move to Snow Valley in Manchester, a mountain that is now closed. And that brought snowboarders, surfers from around the country. At this time, Michigan had a very strong population of snowboarders and surfers. That's where the surfer was invented. So this was consisting of some California people, where Tom Sims was from, some Vermont people, and this was definitely a hold on for dear life race. I don't think anyone made it down without crashing, so it wasn't really, it was whoever got there the quickest, but it also, that time involved wiping out, getting back on your board, going down a little more, wiping out, getting back on, going down a little more. So it was a tough course. And there is a bit of a groundswell, but it's still just this backyard activity. You needed to get it on the mountains. And by now, Jake moves his operations down to Manchester, and this is his barn right out behind his house, and that's where he'll do a lot of the work in the early 80s. And the early 80s is when this company really takes off. But this is his, basically what you had to do to create a board. Rip blocks, draw, backsaw, put in the binding holes, route, edge, sand, corner, sand, put in holes, dip, and I'll get to dipping. But that's how the company was run on that little 3x5 card. These are some great pictures, probably from the early 80s, from the factory itself. All Manchester, Dorset kids, right out of high school, part-time jobs, full-time jobs, a lot of them snowboarders themselves. The worst job was grinding the fins. If you were late or if you were on Jake's bad side, you got the bad job of grinding the fins. But another bad job was dipping the boards, which was, they dipped them in polyurethane after the process was done and sort of hang them up like on a meat rack almost. What they had was a long pole and dipped it in the polyurethane and then put it up. Had to wear a respirator. The polyurethane was very powerful, And many times before the kids could go home after a shift, they had to take mandatory timeouts on the front yard because of the intoxicating effects of the polyurethane. But the turning point is really getting snowboards allowed on Stratton. And Jake and plus some of his employees approached Stratton. Here's Paul Johnson. He was the vice president of operations at Stratton at the time. And Jake and Paul Johnson discussed having some kind of trial period on the mountain. And Paul Johnson went back to the Stratton board. They didn't like the idea at all. And Paul kind of ignored him and said, all right, we're going to do a trial period. But we're not just going to let these people up on the mountain and hurt everyone and wipe out and have total chaos on the mountain. We need some kind of regulated system to certify these new sport riders. So they set up a certification program in a ski school at the base of the mountain, run by Burton. So Burton brought up their own employees to serve as teachers, and you had to get certified before you can get on the lifts. Do a left turn, right turn, come to a stop, learn how to get off the lift. And you got that for the lower mountain, and then if you had to go through another certification to get to the upper mountain. Mark Heingartner from the Manchester, Dorset area, he was the first instructor, you can say, at Stratton. If you wanted to get on a lift at Stratton, you had to go through him. And through my research, there's countless stories of people complaining in humor how he failed them many times and how he made them work hard to get that certification to get on the lifts. In addition to being an instructor, he was also world champion at the US Open for several years. And he also worked in the offices at Burton. But here is the certification. You got a separate pass, and what you did is once you got on the lower mountain, you got signed off. So when you went through the ticket line, the ticket checkers would look and see if you're allowed on the lower mountain. And then you got one for the upper mountain as well. And these Trisha Burns, she was in the 2002 Olympics. Doug Burns, her brother, was a great snowboarder. Scott Johnson is now a coach at Stratton Mountain School. So a lot of people who had to go through this program to get onto the lifts and then rose in the ranks of snowboarding. It was not an easy transition. There was a lot of us and them, skiers versus snowboarders. A lot of skiers didn't like this new sport. They didn't like the fact that the snowboarders were scraping away the snow. So there was some early segregation at the mountain. Tamarack Trail actually was alpine skiing only. And seeing this picture right here was not a picture you see all the time today, but back then, skiers and snowboarders riding together was, you didn't see it as much. The ski patrol didn't really like the snowboarders as well in the beginning. For one, a lot more upper body injuries, a lot of collarbone breaks. They saw a difference in injuries. And then the Stratton Ski Patrol also loves their own personal back trails. And they didn't like it when the snowboarders went off into the woods and, according to the Ski Patrol, ruined their back trails. So they would often create diversions and false entries, and they really tried to protect their backcountry skiing. Stratton Mountain School served as a breeding ground for a lot of these early snowboarders. They were all skiers at that point. Stratton Mountain School did not have a snowboard program in the early 80s. In fact, it wouldn't get one until the 90s, really. So people like Steve Hayes, and Tara Eberhard were both alpine skiers and snowboarded whenever they could. And both, Tara Eberhard will eventually become a world champion. Steve Hayes will be a high-ranked competitor. He was actually, at one point during his time at Stratton Mountain School, he had to sign a form saying, you must ski, you're not allowed to snowboard, you got to stay in the ski program. And then they finally released him of it and said, you know, you're going to have a much bigger career if you stick with snowboarding, so go ahead and snowboard. And so a common theme during this time is also a lot of former skiers who are bored with skiing, pick up snowboards for the first time, and because of the primitive nature of the time, it was ripe for opportunity. So all these people who are picking it up for the first time, since they are the pathfinders of the sport, are going to rise quickly through the ranks. The Coughlin brothers, Jack on the left, Andy on the right, both, they worked in the factory, they dipped the boards, grinded the fins. And Andy Coughlin was a US Open champion several times. The board itself would definitely evolve. These have like skegs on the bottom, like fins, and that was the first early boards. So, you know, a fin anytime you catch in the snow. So it took a while for just to have a snowboard that actually resembled a ski with edges and P-Tex bottoms. The Hayes brothers, Mike and Steve, Mike on the left, Steve on the right, were the first kids. They're my age, so they're probably in their teens, early teens, in the early 80s. They were the first ones that were allowed to go to the upper mountain. They were the first ones to go through Mike Harngartner, and were the first, everyone looked up to them. I mean, I can remember just everyone saying, there's the Hayes brothers, they're so good, they're the ones that can go to the upper mountain. And they joined the team as well, and also went to college up at UVM at the same time, balancing the two. Also known for their, I won't talk about as much, but the Hayes brothers parties in their basement every US Open weekend were a thing of legend. Tara Eberhard, former skier and Stratton Mountain student. The company is growing exponentially at this time. Once it gets allowed on the mountains, kids are just asking for snowboards and they want them. And so Burton does yet another move, goes to Industrial Park in Manchester, and still primarily wood boards, as you can see here. And as legend has it, back at the older barn, the red barn that I showed you before, all the defects or anything that didn't pass the seal of approval, all the defect boards were kept in that red barn. So years later, people would try to sneak into that barn and steal themselves a nice wood board, because I mean, these boards today are highly sought after. You look on eBay and they draw a high number. And on some of those earlier boards I showed that just had the string on them, they're a very popular item and hard to find. Putting out ads. This is growing so big, he doesn't even have to he has to move beyond the local high school population to bring in employees. Looking through these, I'm sure a lot of people would say there's some dream jobs in there. Team coach was probably a great job, traveling with the team. Probably a job you don't see in the newspaper these days. This is the crew known as the Glebelands crew. They were from Magic Mountain area, and Magic Mountain's also known as Glebe Mountain. And they were kids who did most of their boarding at Bromley, but they'd go down to the Burton factory just about every day after a day of snowboarding. They'd video themselves all day doing tricks, and the Burton factory sort of turned into a hangout. It had a retail store, it had couches, and it was just a really popular place to hang out for a lot of kids. So these Glebeland kids would go down and put their videos on the widescreen and watch their tricks all day. And were kind of a pain. You know, they were teenagers, and the guy was Emmett Manning was the store manager at the time, and he was trying to run a retail operation. And, but they got along pretty well, and eventually pretty much everyone in the Glebland's crew went on to work for Burton in some capacity. Scott Lenhart is a respected artist. He designed many pro boards and done a lot of posters for the Burton US Open. Shem Roos became a well-known photographer in the snowboard world. Randy Gaetano was a team rider. So these were just kids hanging out in a store, and they all just used Burton as sort of a launching pad for their own careers. They're all doing other things now, years later, but all in the outdoor sports industry in some way. And Burton served as sort of the breeding ground for that. So by the mid-'80s, this is a 1985 shot, they have a Burton team, but there's a real alpine feel here. They have the alpine suits that you'd see in skiing. Most of the pictures you see are going through gates. Snowboarding hadn't made the transition that it has done today. It was very similar to downhill racing. You did a slalom event, you did a downhill event, eventually had sort of a GS type event, but none of what you see in any given event today. And there is snowboarding education develops as well. Susie Ruick, also a graduate of the Stratton Mountain School, a skier, and then Mark Heingartner. They start what's called the Allegro program at Stratton, which was a weekend program. Snowboarders learned to snowboard and then eventually became racers as well. And Scott Palmer on the right, he's of Dorset area, and he started off working in the factory, then became a coach, and then he will become the first Stratton Mountain School snowboard coach and will be responsible for teaching Ross Powers. And so, and they, in doing the interviews for the books, I mean, just about every person I interviewed, some had some experience of one of those three right there. So these three right here are really responsible for getting so many of snowboarders their first taste. The Green Mountain Series was a weekend event, races all up and down the state, an opportunity for kids to try racing. And in these pictures here, hard to point out, but Tricia Burns, once again, 2002 Olympics. They all get their start here, and these are just all pictures from their medal ceremonies. Eventually, Stratton is going to take over the ski school, the snowboarding school program. Burton, for those first couple of seasons, did it, and then Stratton's going to wrestle control from it, and they're going to hire their own coaches. There was a few problems in the beginning, though, because for one, the ski school program director didn't really know what snowboarding was about. And so they made him wear the same clothing as the ski school instructors, which was whatever, the Obermeyer wear and stretch pants, and which just didn't work for snowboarding. Snowboarding, you need to have a certain type of apparel. So they had to wear these really uncomfortable clothes that just did not work in snowboarding. And they also had another problem. For every lesson session, they had something called lineup, and all the instructors would line up in a row, with skis like this next to each other. And the snowboarders couldn't do that. You know, when they got up to lineup, they had to stand like this, and they were just all uncomfortable, and they still had to sort of follow the rules of the ski school. So there was sort of some growing pains there in terms of the snowboard school getting its own identity, and eventually did. They realized that they couldn't do the same things the ski instructors had to do. They had to have their own autonomy, really. But there is going to be a big change, and it stems from a town dump in Lake Tahoe out in California. And the a whole bunch of snowboarders out there. They see that there's a dump, there's a big, I guess, a wall, and they realize that they can go down one side and go up it and hit it as a jump and then come back down and land in it. And these California snowboarders have skater backgrounds, so they're thinking about the pools they used to skateboard in, and this whole idea of the half pipe is developing out west. Not really taking root on the East Coast yet. The snowboarders on the East Coast are still in their suits doing the gates thing. To such a degree, when the East Coast snowboarders would go out west and there was the jumping competitions, they would boycott it. And when the West Coasters came here and there wasn't any jumping, it was all gates, they would boycott it. They weren't seeing eye to eye. And also, as we get into the late 80s, 90s, there's a strong European presence. And they were carvers. They didn't like to leave the ground yet either, and they had such a beautiful fluid style, and they were just known for doing wonderful turns, and they dominated a lot of the alpine events. Peter Bauer from Germany right there. But the half pipe is going to change things, and it's going to change the nature of the sport. It's going to change the nature of the competition. And so Stratton goes and tries to build a half pipe. The first half pipe they actually dug in the summer and dug a half pipe out of the dirt. Here it is right here, which didn't work so well because come spring, it was just mud at the bottom. The base would disappear. So there was a lot of trial and error, like how are we going to make a half pipe? And so there's also going to be a transition of the sort of the face of Burton too. It's going to go from all these alpine base boarders to the guys that leave the air, like Craig Kelly here. So they're going to also go through a big marketing move in terms of who's going to be on the cover, who's going to be part of the photo shoots. And you're going to see less and less pictures of people going through gates and more pictures of people leaving the ground. So the half pipe, after digging it in the summer, that didn't work so hot. So they decided we'll blow lots of snow and then we'll carve the half pipe out of the snow. And Paul Johnson, who I showed a picture earlier, who allowed snowboarding for the first time, he had piles of snow blown, and then he had a lot of snowboarding kids help dig the pipe. And it was so hard. Like they were out there with shovels and just digging away at these piles of snow, and they just couldn't get it done. So Paul Johnson decided he was going to call a local excavator, Lyle Blaisdell, and he brought his excavator up there. And I mean, I don't know how to even do research on this, but he's got to be the most famous excavator in Vermont in the 90s, easily, because I mean, he's also in the interviews. I mean, he's so known in the snowboard world because of what he does with that thing. I mean, he was a real artist in terms of cutting the transition. He made like a certain plate that he attached, like a metal plate that he attached to the end of the bucket. So he made a perfect sort of carve down. And he just became a master at this making a half pipe. Now they have these massive machines, pipe dragons, that just go down and shape them automatically, these huge arms of curved cutters. And, but this is what we're dealing with at this time. A lot of improvisation, like how are we going to do this? And you can see it in so many different parts of the sport, you know, in terms of making the half pipe, how are we going to do it? In those early alpine events, they didn't know, the boarders were having trouble doing backside turns, so they would take milk cartons, like the crates, cut them up and put them attach them to their back like this, so they could get more stability in their turns. But they're figuring this stuff out. There is no real blueprint, really. So there's a lot of trial and error and figuring things out. Just a picture of the half pipe. You compare it to the pipes that you see in the Olympics now. It's not much. So just to see the development of the sport is unbelievable. But just the fact that there's a dog in the middle of the half pipe does show the intimacy of these early U.S. Open events. I mean, it was you could go up there, grab a side, sit on the side, and watch great competitors, watch your friends. There's a real sort of connection between the spectator and the athlete that you wouldn't see in any other sport. So 1988 will be the first U.S. Open at Stratton that will have a half-pipe competition. And you'll see it in the marketing up on the left, but you're also going to see a new style enter the scene. And any form of conservatism that snowboarding had at that moment, especially on a fashion sense, is going to go away. And most of these guys are all West Coasters, and with them they bring a little more of that skateboard ethos that you see a lot more today. Laurie Asperis, this picture right here, did sort of the 1980s version of going viral. Like, it ended up in magazines and sort of put a new face on snowboarding, this going out in your shorts and your t-shirts, and helped sort of promote this new direction in the sport. A lot of locals well, not even locals, I'll say Vermonters gravitate towards Stratton and this half-pipe. It gets a reputation as being the best half-pipe on the East Coast. So Stratton will become a destination for competitors. These are the two Seths, Seth Neary and Seth Miller from northern Vermont. Jason Ford is from Pownell area. Jason Goldsmith was from Brattleboro. Todd Richards is from over in New Hampshire. A lot of these great boarders are going to use Stratton as their home base. And they'd go to the mountain and they would never get on a chairlift. They would hike the pipe all day long, up and down, up and down. A lot of times they didn't buy tickets. The ticket checker would come up and try to check their tickets, and as the ticket checker would go up one side of the pipe, they would all just go down and go up on the other side of the pipe and play that game all day long. Finally, the mountain decided to create a half-pipe ticket, so these kids could just go and ride the pipe. They had no interest in riding the trails or the lifts. A group comes down from northern Vermont. They're called the VTSP, Vermont Slope Posse. 5 kids from like Chittenden County, Jeff Brushy and Chris Swears. Jeff Brushy is going to become a legend within the sport. Using northern Vermont as a base, but coming down to Stratton quite a bit, and southern Vermont. In the U.S. Open, I mean, another thing I don't really focus on too much in the book is all the great competitors from outside of the Vermont area that come. Turjay Hawkinson is a legendary international boarder. Jeff Brushy, I just talked about a little bit. Todd Richards, I talked about a little bit. Craig Kelly, these are all snowboarders who are going to gain international attention. And who will be at Stratton, but they won't really call it home. But the U.S. Open seemed like the U.S. Open. Every time it came around, every March, it was an opportunity for everyone to show their best stuff, and that usually did happen. Craig Kelly, in this particular U.S. Open, he had to ride on a black board. There was an early contract. He rode for Sims, and Jake Carpenter had stolen him from Sims, but because of contracts and legal issues, he couldn't ride a board that had a Burton on it, right here. So he rode something that was called the Mystery Air, and it was all black, and it turned into such a great marketing ploy. They actually developed the board and called it the Mystery Air, and at the trade shows out in Las Vegas, they didn't have a board to actually show people. So they just had a big crate that said Mystery Air on that, and everybody wanted to know what was in that crate, what was that board, and it sold like hotcakes, and it was a sort of a great marketing ploy. Ross Powers, the many faces of Ross Powers. He gets a snowboard for Christmas one year. His brother and himself get one board. They have to share the board. He goes up to Bromley. His mom works as a cashier in the Bromley cafeteria, still works there today. while his mom works, he goes out and he uses the Green Mountain series I was talking about. He's part of the Allegro program. He does all these things that so many other boarders do. Becomes the first part of the first snowboarding class at Stratton Mountain School. Here he is studying. That's a good picture. He's down in the Eastern Edge, which is a magazine, in the offices doing his homework. Eventually going to Nagano in 1988, where he got a bronze, and then Salt Lake City, where he got the gold. And now he's a coach at Stratton Mountain School. And just this past couple of weeks, he was elected to the Vermont Snowboard and Ski Museum's Hall of Fame. But he was somebody that everyone saw from just a little kid and rising through the ranks to gold medalist. And his fame came in lots of different ways. That's a life-size Lego of him. And has a doll, an action figure, and he was on the cover of Frosted Flakes. So some evidence that snowboarding really had come to a new level. And the Olympics have a lot to do with that. The Olympics are the sea change for the sport in terms of being this sort of fringe activity that had a good following, but it hadn't really hit the mainstream. Once the Olympics happen, things are going to change. Two other people, Vermonters, who were at the '98 Olympics, Betsy Shaw of Manchester and Ron Quixote, who used Stratton as his home mountain. The '98 Olympics were not a great coming out party for snowboarding. The snowboarders were sort of removed from the rest of the Olympic village, so they didn't have quite the experience that the rest of the Olympic athletes did. The media was fascinated with them, but they were much more fascinated with just making fun of them, like knuckle draggers and hippies, and calling them skateboard punks and making fun of their fashion, and not really giving the sport the respect that it really deserved. I think something like the program misspelled snowboarder. So there was a lot of, it was not the most memorable coming out party for the sport, but it was a starting point. Tricia and Doug Burns, two people that I can remember from sitting in the base lodge every morning and then they getting their snowboards on, and just becoming becoming a US Open champion and then going to the Olympics. Doug, person that was respected by so many people, everyone loved him, and everyone just says that he had such a great attitude and was so kind to everyone. Unfortunately, he died in 1998 of an asthma attack. But Stratton did pay honor to him. They called the snowboard halfpipe area, they called it East Burnside after him. And so the mountain remembered this young man. The US Open, I was talking about the intimacy. They couldn't get more intimate than that. As the guys hit the halfpipe, they're giving a high five to the crowds. And the crowds, me being one of those people, would go up there and sit up there all day long, and it was a fun time up there, and to have an experience like that. Chris Copley on the left, he worked in the marketing department at Stratton, and he became the MC for the halfpipe, which was, there's a lot of descriptions of the moves, what's the move the snowboarder is doing, where the snowboarder's from. So he had a real good knowledge of the sport. And as the crowds increase at the US Open, especially after the Olympics, from like 1998 onwards, the US Open crowds at Stratton are going to become almost a problem. And the half-pipe crowds are also going to become a problem. Snowball fights, lots of drunken behavior, kegs up at the half-pipe, things like that. So his job duties also turned into a little bit of crowd control as well. Some scenes of some of the tomfoolery that would be happening at the half pipe. As I said, whoops, have some kegs right there at the pipe, competitors drinking from 40s as they're walking up the pipe. And this right here was a makeshift bar that a whole bunch of people brought up. They came up early in the morning with 4x4s and chicken wire and told the Stratton employees that they were making a VIP viewing area for Burton. And really what it was just a sort of a slopeside fraternity house, resulting in people getting into their Cookie Monster and Tony the Tiger outfits and getting on snowboards and doing tricks with their outfits on. The makeshift bar eventually collapses and nobody was hurt, but it didn't meet the snuff to have all those people up on it. A lot of people think this is sort of the pinnacle of the US Open intimacy, this ability to have this much fun by the right there and watch the competitors. Also have the poachers. The poachers become sort of part of the half pipe. Sort of like when you're at a football game, they have these things called TV timeouts where everything stops and everyone's sitting around wondering what to do. So what would happen at the US Open when they had these timeouts, poachers would come down and they would just hit the pipe on their own. There wouldn't be competitors, and became a show in themselves because they often just didn't really care, and they would go higher and faster than any of the competitors did, and it became almost a sideshow in itself. And they used to be truly poachers. They'd jump in and do it and then like run off. By the time the US Open got into post-millennium, the poachers were actually predetermined. Like they actually became part of the event, like poacher number 1, poacher number 2, and they were sent down at predetermined times. So even sort of that rebel spirit of it sort of became formalized as well. Typical crowd scene in the probably late 90s, early 2000s. I can remember being at the US Open in 1998 and sitting up at the Grizzlies bar looking down on the crowds in the Base Lodge area, and it was a riot. I mean, there were fights everywhere, smoke rising up, cops just not able to handle it. It was really getting out of control. The event was becoming too big for the environment. We also have lots of homeowners very upset. This is the Base Lodge. They're a family of 5 with their young kids are trying to get back to their condos and enjoy their weekend, and there's just chaos on the mountain. So there is going to be this contention between Burton and Stratton as the event gets bigger and bigger. A sort of a side story to how big it was and how chaotic it would be. After the US Open, there was sort of this downtime. I mean, not after the halfpipe competition. There would be about 2 to 3 hours between the end of the last event and when the music started. So there was a lot of milling about, a lot of people inebriated and fired up. And one event that would happen, they would all gather in the courtyard, and the competitors were staying in the hotel, and they made a habit of throwing their goggles out or their mittens or their bibs out to the fans down below as keepsakes. As these pictures show, this particular year, 1996, I believe, Turjay Hawkinson throws out his snowboard and creates a near riot in the stands down below. Just people grasping for it, grasping for a rock and roll stars item. And just an interesting picture of not the same snowboard, but the snowboard leaving the window and heading down to the crowds below. So Stratton Base Lodge, that's where the event used to be. They move it over to the Sun Bowl, which was on sort of the other side of the mountain, a separate little area. And it was an effective way to deal with the crowds. They were able to isolate the US Open crowds, the regular weekenders, the skiers, the people who weren't there for the US Open could still enjoy the base lodge area. But something really happens there. It becomes a lot more corporate sponsors, there's a lot more security, the event becomes much more formalized and really signifies this sort of transition from fringe to the mainstream. And it just wasn't really quite the same once it went over to the Sun Bowl. It kind of lost what so many people thought was sort of the essence of the sport, which was that sort of intimate feeling. So 2012 will serve as the swan song for the event. And the same picture that's on the cover of my book, there was almost clues to the fact that it was gonna leave. You didn't know it was gonna leave during the event. But Burton that year put on a lot of retrospective exhibits. They showed old boards, they showed old pictures of previous US Opens. Their main poster showed a picture from 1986. There was sort of this nostalgia for this year's event, and whether or not it was predetermined or not, that nostalgia did serve as a good indicator that it was going to leave and go to Vail. And just the item on the right was the events from the last US Open. But something did happen at US Open that served as a foundation for the future, and that was the Friday Washed Up Cup. And that was a separate event that they started to hold, and that was an opportunity for all the old snowboarders, the champions from the 80s and the 90s, a chance to compete. Just a simple gates, and it was an opportunity for reunion, really. And once the US Open leaves Stratton, I'm going to pass that, it becomes now they have the Vermont Open, almost the same weekend. And the Washed Up Cup, which is on the left there, that still happens all the time, every year. And the Vermont Open is now the weekend event, is organized by Steve and Mike Hayes, those two young men that I showed you earlier in the video presentation, that started off as the first certified snowboarders. They eventually owned their own snowboard company in the 90s called Hayes Brothers Snowboarding. And then they start the Vermont Open. And that is where it's the continuity right there. The US Open and the role of Stratton in the birth of snowboarding was important, but now there's a new chapter, and that's the Vermont Open. And now, the Hayes' children are competing. Ross Powers' daughter, Victoria Powers, is a Stratton Mountain School student, and she's a competitor. So now there's the new generation, and the Vermont Open is going to, through sort of this grassroots experience, is becoming the new event. And I end it there.